Welcome to Performance Talk with your host, Yul Gordon and Chris Costa, where professionals discuss the latest news and developments in the profession and all areas that affect sports performance, strength and conditioning, nutrition, recovery, performance, and much more. Listen now to your host and this week's guest, next on Performance Talk.
This is our 2024 version of our Roundtable series, and this one is a new one, one that we're opening up today. It is the Sports Science Roundtable. Chris, how are you doing?
Well, good. Not new, but new. I should say not new guests, but a new sector that we're going to focus on here. I'm doing well. I think everybody else is probably doing pretty good here. Tim, how you doing? Paul, how you doing?
Good. End of the semester. I'm happy.
Yeah, everybody loves that.
All good. Now I've officially finished for the festive period, so I can put my feet up a little bit while also trying to catch up with stuff that I should have already completed.
Moderate decompression, but work's still there to do. We all know that. So hosts, we kind of like to have the same guys on for these. We realize that the people we've selected in the past have been great, so we're going to stick to that same paradigm and keep going through this. We are missing Craig Lane, though, however. He's got a health-related issue, and hopefully he's going to get through that just fine. Maybe he'll pop in, and we'll see him, but otherwise we're going to roll with Paul and Tim. You just got the intro from those guys. You usually likes to do an intro, but I don't think these guys need an intro. Everybody that listens to this show knows exactly who the guys are that we're talking to today. So let's just start this thing immediately right off with last year we were on the show, right? We talked about strength and conditioning, but what's new in sports science right now? What's one thing that you can say you didn't realize last year and we're now like, whoa, this is new. This is something I didn't expect.
I think we're getting to the point where we realize that a lot of the information that is coming out in terms of profiling an individual or using performance testing ratios and everything may not necessarily be the be-all end-all, as some people may believe. And I only say it that way because what seems to be easy is what individuals want to kind of follow the trend for. I'll just use dynamic strength index as an example, or force velocity profiling. Nothing's ever going to be as simple as this is a number, you should chase that number, and then you'll become a better athlete. Everything needs to be put into context. And I think we're getting to the point where we realize that more, but also putting it into the context of it's not just about one form of testing. In order to assess the holistic athlete, we have to understand the different types of force and strength development. So, reactive strength, maximal strength, ballistic strength and isometric strength, et cetera, et cetera. So I know Paul's done a couple talks on that, on those topics. And I know I'm giving a talk at the NSCA Coaches Conference this next month about kind of testing ratios and athlete profiling. But I think that's the direction that we're heading, which I thankfully I'm happy for.
Paul.
Yeah, I agree. I think, there's there's a lot of stuff out there that people think is new. Most of it is the same thing being reinvented. So perfect example, if you look at things like isometric strength testing and training, Alex Natera have done a lot of work in that area, and he refers to, for example, a knee iso push. It's a single leg isometric squat. Why don't we just call it what it is? We don't call it what it is because it makes, you can then make it unique. It's known to be related to you, but it is not new. It's not new in any way. And actually, if we want to break some of these things down, sometimes it loses part of its meaning. Well, you don't push with your knee. And there's also hip extensors working. So there's a lot of stuff out there that gets branded, rebranded again. Most of it you can trace back to 1940s, 50s, 60s. Some of it, Nordic hamstring exercise. There's old manuals for physical conditioning for skiing going back into I think it's the 1890s. You've got the Nordic hamstring exercise in there. So unfortunately, most people aren't creating anything new. It's just stuff being rebranded, or we're getting a better understanding of some of those things. Like, Tim raised the point about some of the testing paradigms that we can use for the different physical qualities. And we're starting to, and I say starting to, because not everybody is, get a much better understanding if we're looking at force time data from testing on a force play of what metrics are meaningful, which are completely nonsensical and been made up, but people like the term. And it's easy for a coach to understand, etc. So we're starting to get a much better understanding of some of those areas, but it still needs a lot more work. Because again, part of the problem is if we've got 3 or 4 different names for the same thing, that creates confusion. People think they're talking about different things, and it's the same thing. So there's not really anything particularly new in the area in terms of things that have been that are currently common trends. It's the same things recycled, which seems to happen one decade after another. Well, that makes me feel quite old saying that as well, because I've seen things go around in a few cycles.
Come on over here to my club.
I mean, we're all old enough at this point, especially in this group of people here. So when are we going to realize? Well, I think we've realized, but when are we going to accept that less is more when it comes to data? And you're talking about
I think Paul kind of made that comment about, what variables are actually important. I mean, if we're looking at force plate data, for example, you can tell a lot about an athlete, at least their performances, by looking at 3 metrics. You can look at their impulse, their net impulse, that being said, the force during or within that impulse, and the time at which the impulse actually occurred. So it comes down to the shape of the actual impulse itself. The impulse is going to make us move. How quickly we complete the task is kind of going to tell us a little bit more about the athlete. Is it more of a peaked impulse versus a flat impulse? What phase of the movement are they actually performing? So if we take a counter movement jump, which has been analyzed like no other exercise out there, most commonly assessed exercise, we can look at braking characteristics. We can look at propulsion characteristics, the shape of those impulses. And doing the same thing, you can make a direct comparison with an isometric mid-thigh pull or an iso squat, because you can get the same data from it. So doing comparisons that way. But the reality is what makes us move is force, and the time at which we do it is going to be task specific. So it kind of tells us very basics what it's coming down to. And, if you go through and do specific equations, physics hasn't changed in a really long time from my understanding. I like to say Newton was the first strength coach that was out there. But I had a conversation with a grad student the other day they said, well, I want to look at jump height, takeoff velocity, and net relative impulse. And I said, well, that's great, but you basically calculated the same thing 3 different ways, because jump height is dictated by takeoff velocity, and you can get takeoff velocity by taking net propulsive impulse and divide it by the individual's body weight. You just calculated the same thing 3 ways. So they said, yeah, the correlation's really high. And I'm like,
it should be.
It should be.
Yeah, I have I think that we overemphasize stuff for sure. Because we think it's going to be cool and new and hip, and it's going to be valuable. And like Paul said earlier, we want to create a niche for ourselves, right? So we say, well, this is going to be really important, and we focus on studying that, and we produce papers that might reflect our biases. But I think just from a personal perspective, literally just looking at the curve sometimes can be enough to tell you what an athlete's current state is. You don't even need to look at the numbers. You can just compare one curve to the last curve to the last curve, and basically find a pretty good standard right there. Then if you need to dive further, if you're really in the weeds in data and you need those physical numbers, then fine, dive into the numbers. But a curve can tell you a lot if you understand the curve, if you understand each stage of the curve. And that may be the harder part, right? Than deducing numbers that fall into a range, an average for that person, and saying, okay, they're outside of their average. Well, but what does that then actually mean? Look at the curve and see how they go through the entire sequence, right? And then make a determination as to, do we need to change programming for the day or the week? Or do we need to shift our focus to something else? Are we not priming this athlete properly? How often do you guys kind of take the numbers out of the equation and do a little bit more of a, we'll say, subjective approach like that?
Well, definitely have a look at the curve and look at the shape. The biggest problem is making that direct comparison. So what a lot of people do in the research is go through a statistical procedure called statistical parametric mapping, but you time normalize it then. And if you time normalize a curve, you can miss a huge amount of information, because we know if we're looking at change is acutely, is somebody fatigued from one day to the next? It's the temporal aspects, it's the duration of the phases which tends to change. So if you time normalize it, suddenly you might be missing some of the key things that you were really looking for. And the phases may occur at different points, so they might not be aligned appropriately. So from that sort of point of view, I'm not suggesting for one moment that statistical parametric mapping isn't good. From a research point of view, it's fantastic, but we still need to be mindful that it misses the time component with it, because we've normalized it full time. It gives you a good indication if the shape of the curves change. So if you've gone from a unimodal curve where it spikes and comes back down to a bimodal where there's a peak during the braking phase and then another peak in the propulsive phase, that tells you there's definitely something different going on with their movement strategy. That also gives you an idea of, well, what do I need to look at now? What could have changed that movement strategy? Have they unweighted quicker, hit the brakes harder, but that's actually buried them? You know, they can't generate enough force to get back out of the hole quickly enough. And acutely, whether that tells us anything or not that's difficult to figure out, because we need to look at a lot of data. Chronically over time, you actually see that. If you look back to Cormier's papers back in 2007, 2008, just from doing heavy strength training, the unweighting phase decreased in time, so you moved faster. The braking phase reduced in time, so a much higher braking impulse, as Tim referred to. And it still resulted in a higher jump height, but only because the person was stronger. Mm-hmm. We've tried this with student athletes, cue them to move faster. And then as soon as they unweight really quickly, they get stuck at the bottom. You actually see a prolonged amortization phase. Mm-hmm. They can't cope with those forces. So sometimes with that sort of stuff, we've got to identify, do we need to change their strategy by cueing them to move differently? And with some people, you watch them move and just go, you know, you'll have all done it as coaches, put your head in your hands. Oh my God, why are they moving like that? We have to cue them then. We have to make sure they can move appropriately. But actually to see big changes in the unweighting, braking and propulsion phases, the easiest thing to do is train them appropriately, get them stronger. And you naturally see that unweighting and braking phase changes dramatically. Even though you focused on maybe high load, you know, isotonic standard squat style training, you still see massive improvements in those other phases just because they're now stronger. So they can generate a much higher impulse to decrease their momentum from that higher momentum on the way down where they unweight quicker. So it's really useful to look at those curves. But if more than anything, I find that's useful to then say, well, which of the metrics do I need to focus on? Rather than just go, well, jump height changed. Right. Okay, let's try and figure out how it changed. And you've got 100+ metrics. If you look at the curve, you can go, well, these aspects changed. There's a key difference between braking and propulsion compared to what they used to be. Let's look at that specific data.
I got a whole mountain of mush here that I'm going to try to get a question out of, and not from you guys, in my brain. You talked about how they move and those kind of things, unweighting and braking, and you know, all that's relevant to how they're producing force or not producing force. But I want to come at it from the direction of cueing or communication, and go back to what you said, Paul, about you know, terms, old terms, new terms, the confusion of terms for the athlete if we're not uniform in how we talk to them on the basics. Squat, jump, land, break, those things. So tell our audience and our young professionals out there a little bit about why uh a togetherness in communication or terms needs to happen, and why it's not always good to just make terms up.
Well, I think some of that goes back to the point that Tim made. Physics hasn't changed.
Right.
So we know what some of those terms should be in terms of the underpinning physics. So, you can use things like, I got sent a paper yesterday, really interesting paper, but they use the term rate of velocity development. It's acceleration. It's a change in velocity. It's acceleration. So why isn't it called acceleration?
Yeah.
And again, you can trace that back to studies from 20 years ago. And because it's been used, more people use it. But we need to make sure that we understand the underpinning physiology or biomechanics, depending on what we're talking about, to make sure that communication is consistent. I've had it before where people have said to me, "Oh, you and such a researcher disagree." And I'm like, "No, we don't. Well, you use this term and they use that term." Like, yeah, right. But it means the same thing. And again, that's where it's really important, because otherwise, Tim and I could both coach the same athlete. Tim coaches them one day, I coach them another day, and they think we're telling them different things because we're using different terminology.
Right.
But if we can keep it simple and standardize things early on, and fine, if an athlete then doesn't understand the terminology we're using, we will have to change it. But changing it for the sake of it is somewhat problematic. And also, if we're using that for cueing an athlete to move a certain way,
right,
we've got to be really mindful. Like if you look at a counter movement jump, if you tell somebody to jump high or tell somebody to jump fast, they completely change the strategy. Jump high, they're more compliant. They go through a bigger range of motion. It gives them more time to apply force and accelerate on the way up. They'll jump higher. Tell them to move fast, they try and do everything as quick as possible. Less time to produce impulse, they don't jump as high. So even simple things like when we're training an athlete, if I want somebody's jump height to improve and I'm cueing them to jump high, they will naturally adopt a strategy that allows them to jump higher. If somebody else comes in and cues them in a different way, they might be completely changing the way they're moving, and therefore they'll stress the body's systems and structures in a different way, and therefore the adaptation will be different because the stimulus was different. So there's a whole range of reasons we need to make sure our terminology is as consistent as possible. And that's so people understand the research, but also so athletes don't get confused when we're asking them to do the same task in the same way, but we both use the different terminology, and you can see it. You watch your athletes, their eyes glaze over, they're just confused.
Yeah, exactly.
Then you think, right, that didn't work. I need a different term.
Or they give you that Daffy Duck look.
Yeah.
Let me go back.
Well, the classic example is researchers versus practitioners, because what ends up happening, and there's been multiple discussions about this, is the term explosive. So practitioners and strength and conditioning coaches, et cetera, will say to an athlete, be explosive or explode out of that position. But the researchers or the hardcore biomechanists will say, well, athletes don't explode. So you need to tell them to be impulsive. And, that in itself has a negative context to it. I was told that as a, trying to publish a paper, going back and forth with reviewers. And I said, if I tell an athlete to be impulsive, they will have no clue what I'm talking about.
Right.
But if I tell them to be explosive, due to years and years of using that term, it may not be from a physics standpoint 100% correct, but they understand it. And, Yul, going back to your point about communication with athletes are going to respond a different way to the cues that you give them. Right. But that also comes down to a point of trying to create the autonomous athlete. And, you want to give them enough feedback up front so that they understand what the big changes that need to be fixed, the biggest issues. But then you start to give them less and less in terms of cueing, because they start to create the ability to perform each task by themselves and kind of self-correct. The classic example is if you watch an athlete first learn how to do an exercise, they, they're moving all sorts of wonky ways. They're not necessarily performing it very efficiently. Okay, let me give you some cues to fix the big things so that we can move a little bit better. Once they start to move a little bit better, then they start to ask questions and they say, what can I fix? Okay, give them a little bit more feedback because you're now fine tuning the movement and making it better. The best feeling as a coach is when you watch the athlete, they complete the exercise or the movement, and then you can kind of see the wheels turning to think about what did I do wrong? And then they start to self-correct. They may look to you for one cue or something like that, but at that point, you're pretty much giving them one word cues: back, tight, chest, like those types of things, so they understand what they need to fix. But ultimately, when it comes to cueing and instruction, we're trying to create autonomous athletes. So making sure that our cues are effective is really important.
So in the world of communicating and cueing athletes, I think what both you guys are saying, and stop me if I'm wrong, is there's a language that as professionals we use amongst each other and in research, and then there's another language we use with the athlete. We should marry those together as much as possible, but the tie goes to the athlete. If he doesn't understand, then we have to make it so that they understand what we want them to do. And then if they're just, sometimes you have those athletes that just say, hey coach, just tell me what it is. Some of them, after you get them there, they want to know why, and they want to know the language. Well, what did you say before? Isn't that is that the same thing, or what am I doing different? So there's really a little bit of um guesswork in, I hate to use that term, but guesswork in how you approach the athlete until you get to know them, and then you get to those one word cues, and they kind of understand your language. But I try not to get too far off of the anatomical or physiological, you know, terminology, so that if it's used later, they understand it. If they decide to go look at research, they say, okay, that's what I was doing or whatever.
I would also just make the quick comment that external cueing is generally going to work better than internal cueing.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, if we're doing our isometric mid thigh pull or an exercise that involves the triple extension of the hip, knee, and ankle, you're not going to tell them rapidly extend your hips, knees, and ankles. You're going to say push into the floor.
Right.
They understand that, because now if you start telling them individual joints or muscles, contract your quads really hard, well, that can do a number of things.
Right.
But at the same time, an external cue or an external goal or something like that is going to give them more context within the actual movement itself.
All right. Chris, I didn't mean to cut off your train of thought. I hope you didn't lose it. Go ahead, man.
No, you're good. I was kind of thinking along the lines of we look at research constraints, right? And you guys do this all the time. You're trying to not create a bias by telling an athlete what to do. You want them to generate what you're hoping to see naturally. When we teach undergraduate students the research process, right, it's explain it, now execute it, and don't give any coaching along that way. Practitioners don't do that. We coach all the time. Are we overcoaching as practitioners? Are we saying too much? Tim, you just said, take those extrinsic cueing points, keep them one word, keep them two words, be very hyper specific, but also general at the same time. Are we making mistakes on the practicing side?
I think it depends. It depends when we're cueing and when we're coaching, because if you're in the weight room, or you're out on the court or the pitch, and you're teaching somebody how to change direction properly, you're teaching them how to land properly, that's great. That's what we should be doing. If we see any dysfunction in their movement or anything that doesn't appear to be normal, whatever normal is, but normal based on their anthropometrics, mobility, etc. We need to be cueing them. We need to be giving them more feedback and coaching them, but not over coaching. As Tim said, 1 or 2 words. Let them think about the basics. Try and identify where that movement went wrong. What was the first point in that movement that they needed to correct it, which may eradicate all the other issues. And, you see that a lot with weightlifting. You see people doing weightlifting exercise in the gym, their start position's wrong. Everything goes wrong from thereafter. Correct the start position. There's a whole range of errors that will suddenly improve. But the time that I think we see it quite a lot when I'm pretty lucky where I'm based in the UK, that we go into a lot of different sports teams. They ask us for feedback, guidance on their testing parameters and their testing procedures. And the first thing I'll do is go in and watch them coach a few people, whether that's coach each other or coach some athletes, and run through the tests with them. And what you find is the biggest inconsistency is not the setup of force plates or whatever equipment they're using. It's how they cue them. And that goes back to the point I made earlier. Somebody might be saying jump as high as you can. Somebody might be saying jump as fast as you can. Somebody will put a leaderboard up if they're using force plates, and you've got, the data's being analyzed instantaneously, which is in most systems now. But if I put it up and it has jump height, everyone tries to jump as high as possible, takes longer. If I put up a leaderboard and it's time to take off, everyone reduces time to take off, jump height comes down. So what we've got to do is actually cue them in a way that, if our overall goal is jump height, give them the feedback on jump height, see what changes, but standardize that between testing points. And then don't give them a different cue. If the athlete's now taking 2 seconds, I've never seen anyone take that long, but if someone's taken a long time to perform the counter movement jump, commonly see 1.2 seconds. It's some bigger athletes, but if they're taking a long time, don't cue them to then be faster, because you've just given them a different cue to everyone else, right, and a different cue to what you're used to giving them. So you don't know if any changes are due to the cue you gave them or changes in their physical capability. So all that has to be standardized for testing. But then when we go back into the weight room, if you've got that person that's taking 1.2 seconds, you might cue them then during their training sessions to move faster, be more explosive, as Tim said, although you wouldn't use that in the terminology when you're writing up research. So, you use that terminology to try and get them to move in the way you want them to. And again, there are some examples where you would coach them more. So, for example, if you're doing a drop jump, you're looking at reactive strength, less than 250 millisecond contact time. We need to cue them so they have a short contact time. Otherwise, we're suddenly not testing that physical quality. We're then testing dynamic strength. It's no longer truly plyometric. It's a slow stretch shortening cycle task then. If they're taking 500 milliseconds, it's gone from a drop jump to a depth jump. Right. And then you do need to change that. And I've had a PhD student in the past go and test about 50 athletes, come back, go, look at all this data, it's brilliant. And I went, no, you can't use any of it. You need to go back and retest. Not a single person had 3 trials below 250 milliseconds. So that's no longer a drop jump, it's a depth jump. But that student's PhD student was like, but I thought we needed a natural strategy. Well, you do need a natural strategy, but not to the extent that it's no longer the task you're after.
Choosing the test that's relevant to your goals is the critical piece I hear there.
Yeah, making sure the test is appropriate, and if they're not performing that test in the appropriate way, then we have to cue them. But we want to see as natural a strategy as possible. But if it's something like a drop jump versus a depth jump, they're 2 different tests.
Right.
The key thing is coach them appropriately when you're training them so that you get the adaptation you're afterwards. But when you're testing, unless they're doing something wrong and it's no longer the test you want them to be performing, you need to make sure that you see them move in a way that their physical capability and their skill level allows them to move.
Tim, anything to add there?
Tim, anything to add?
I mean, Paul pretty much covered it. And I know that you made the comment as well about using the test that or what you actually want to assess. I'll be the first person to admit that when it comes to a counter movement jump, there's a lot of people use this metric, is modified reactive strength index. I will tell you, having done research on it, Paul's done research on it, it is a good metric. What I will tell you though is that, is it named appropriately? Probably not. Because a counter movement jump in itself, just the propulsive phase alone is probably longer than the 250 milliseconds in some people. That being said, it wouldn't necessarily qualify as a reactive test. It is a slow stretch shortening cycle test. So within that, it's important to assess individuals if they perform that type of movement using that test. However, if they require shorter ground contact times using something like a drop jump or a counter movement jump, rebound jump to assess reactive strength qualities less than 250 milliseconds, it's definitely important to do. So I realize that this is kind of getting into the testing battery of different types of athletes. But again, cueing and the test setup itself is going to be really important here, because the goals of each test are different.
Do we have enough game data to be able to say that many athletes move that fast in competition on a regular basis? They're fast.
I mean, you can look at a sprint. You can look at a sprint really easily, and they're on the ground. Elite sprinters are going to be on the ground anywhere between 80 to 90 milliseconds per stride. Any strike in terms of a contact is going to be even less than that. But I'd also say, I'm not going to tell you that every single movement in sport is going to be shorter than the 250 milliseconds. But if you ask a basketball player to go up for a rebound, the ball's tipped, and then they have to get off the ground immediately again, there it is right there. You're doing a counter movement jump, rebound jump. So both tasks are going to be relevant. But admittedly, there's only a handful of tests that are really going to accurately assess an individual's reactive strength ability. And we can get into the nuances of each test, but there's limitations to every single one of them. A drop jump, for example, an individual may not actually drop from the height that they're standing on. I don't know if, Paul, you were on this paper, but I know John McMahon, doing some work on that, showed that you may drop from 30% lower than what you're actually standing on, which has kind of led to the development of different tests like the 10-5, as well as the counter movement jump, rebound jump test. So, and of course, the ability to perform with something like a 10-5, where you're doing 10 rebound jumps and taking the 5 that are less than 250 milliseconds, or the shortest ones, it's hard to actually continue to jump vertically on every single one of those, because you may move forward, you may move backwards. So obviously you're taking an average of multiple jumps, but at the same time, becoming familiarized and instructing the individuals to perform them appropriately, it can be a challenge sometimes.
Yeah, just on that point, if you look across the 4 or 5 different studies for a drop jump that have looked at the height you actually fall from, its averages out is plus or minus 20% difference. So if you've got a 30 centimeter box, you could drop from as low as 24, as high as 36. Now, if you do that on one day and you drop from 24, and the next day you drop from 36, you're not comparing like with like.
Right.
10-5 test, the best jumps are always the last 4 or 5. So why do all the ones before that? You end up with a pacing strategy, because if you do 5 jumps instead, the best 2 are at the end of those 5. So it's still a pacing strategy. So yeah, all those different rebound tasks have limitations. The key thing is, whatever you're currently doing, as long as you're getting sub 250 millisecond contact time, keep doing it. Because if I do a 10-5 test with an athlete, or a counter movement rebound jump, or a drop jump, and I try and compare, you're getting completely different scores, completely different values. The demands are different. So stick with whatever you're doing. Don't change it. Well, certainly don't change it part of the way through the season. You can't compare it to any longitudinal data then.
Very true. Should then, as practitioners that maybe they're somewhat newer to sports science, should they then be focusing more on rebound jumping as opposed to counter movement jumping, because there's so much more data there. It's so much more rich in context, being able to decipher and decode that context. Are we actually creating more noise in the rebound jump, or are we creating more noise for the practitioner in the counter movement jump?
Well, I think there's noise in both. And that comes down to how you queue it, how you standardize the testing. If you're using different software to analyze the data, you're going to get different variables. There's all different values. There's a couple of really nice studies by Justin Merrigan that compares a series of the different force plate systems. The key thing is, what we need is a good profile. So we probably need a maximum isometric strength test like the ISO pull or ISO squat. That gives us a true peak isometric force production. We need a ballistic type task like the counter movement jump. We need a reactive jump task to really give us that reactive capability, because in most sports, and it's not all sports and not all positions in all sports, you need to know what their maximum force production is. You need to know ballistic. You need to know that reactive or plyometric aspect, because if I look at all the data we've collected over the last few years, thousands, and it is literally, probably about 4,000 or 5,000 soccer players that we've collected data on pre-season. If you ignore the goalkeepers, generally their ballistic capability is outstanding. It's really good. Reactive, pretty good in most, but there's some where you go, right, that's where they need to train. That's clear. You've got a 50 centimeter counter movement jump, but your rebound task is 25. There's a bit of an issue there. There's far too much of a difference. What that difference should be, who knows? No one's looked at it. But the other thing that I can tell you is every single one of those soccer players, no matter what level of competition, is weak. They need to get stronger. So where we've got those people that have a really good ballistic and a really good reactive strength, the only way they're going to improve that further is to get stronger, because they're using the force they can generate really efficiently. And then the other thing we probably need to have a good idea about is their 1 or 3 RM in the primary exercises, because we can't recommend loading or intensities from a 1 RM strength test. Right. We still need to go back to those 1 or 3 RMs. And it should be a 1 or 3 RM. It shouldn't be a 10 RM, because the measurement error, the further away you get from that 1 RM, the greater the measurement error. It shouldn't be done from velocity, because if you look, generally that overestimates, and that can be as much as 20 or 30% you overestimate by. So to put that in context, let's say I can squat 100 kilos, you overestimate by 20%. So you now say my 1 RM is 120. I'm happy with that. That's great. That makes me feel much better. Then you program me at 90%. I've just got buried at the bottom of that squat. So you're then not training the person appropriately. So right. We need we need a battery of tests. Now, you wouldn't do those all throughout the season. You wouldn't do them weekly. But you might say at the end of each block of training, we'll maybe do an isometric strength test. We may not need to do 1 RMs, because we may be able to approximate that in training from just saying, right, last set, let's see what you can do. And it's not the best approach, but it's better than predicting from velocity. Even though they may be slightly fatigued. We can do a jump test, we can do a rebound test. It takes minimal time. The rebound jump test and the counter movement jump test can be done, at the end of their warm-up before they start their actual strength session. But that gives us a nice profile. But to avoid the confusion, what we need to do is condense down the metrics that we can get. As we've said earlier, you can get 100 plus metrics from a counter movement jump. It's not far off that for an isometric multi-joint test like the IMTP or the ISO squat. It's probably similar for a rebound jump if you're using force plates. But actually, how many of those do we really need? It's a handful. And we may interrogate it in more detail afterwards with 1 or 2 athletes where we're scratching our heads thinking, what do they need to train? But for most athletes, it'll stand out with those tests.
I think just to add on top of that, I think we're getting to the point that at least some of the interest is there anyway. Obviously individuals have created force velocity profiles based on certain tests. The work by Pierre Samazzino and JB Marin has been out there for several years now, talking about identifying an optimal, I'll put in quotes, optimal force velocity profile when it comes to a specific movement. The caution that I would give people is that these are all calculated numbers based on a specific test. example. If I perform a jump squat or a squat jump with several different loads, I can calculate what my optimal profile is to jump higher. Well, that's all well and good. They did the exact same thing doing sprints, and those profiles aren't related to each other. Well, that's a problem if I'm a team sport athlete. If one profile improves and I jump higher, but my sprints don't get better, did you really improve the athlete? Now, again, putting that into context is really important because maybe they're an outstanding sprinter and they have very minimal room to improve. But at the same time, this force velocity profiling needs to incorporate, as Paul mentioned, the isometric component to it. But I'd also argue the eccentric component to it, because we, obviously with force plate analysis, we're able to look at different phases of certain movements. But as of now, at least to date, no one's really looked at force velocity profiling, incorporating concentric, isometric, and eccentric to really show, are we working on the right characteristics for the individuals, or are we targeting what we need to target? Because when we look at reactive strength, for example, we're going to get generally two peaks, or if they're less than 250 milliseconds, one peak, hopefully. But we'll be able to look at kind of the duration of each of those phases, as well as how much force they're actually creating. Ideally, they're able to use or create similar impulses, eccentric and concentrically, if it's being done reactively. But we'd also be able to find, are they lacking eccentric strength with something like that? Or if the strategy that they use during a counter movement jump, as Paul mentioned earlier, buries them at the bottom, because if they are rapidly descending and you see a distinct peak in that eccentric or braking phase, they may not be able to tolerate the forces that they're trying to create. So that may mean that eccentrically they are weak, but propulsively they may actually be fairly strong. Not always the case, as Paul pointed out. They may just be weak in general. But that being said, profiling an athlete encompasses a wide variety of things. I'd also make the argument that when we're testing individuals, counter movement jumps, reactive strength jumps, whether they're drop jumps, rebound jumps, and isometric tests are great. We still have to see how they perform the actual skill itself. Because if I can produce a lot of force and produce it over a short period of time, that's great. But is it going to relate to my ability to sprint and change direction? Because it's one thing to have the force capacity to do it. It's another thing to be able to perform the task efficiently in terms of body positions, mobility, blah, blah, blah. I think this comes down to how we're assessing the athlete, both from a quantitative standpoint, but also a qualitative standpoint as well.
That brings in factors of psychological well-being too. They might be, we've all seen great athletes in the weight room, and then they get out there on the field of the pitch and they're struggling to compete, struggling to put it all together. And it's like, they're capable, but there's some mental block potentially there. There's some emotional withholding that is, preventing them from actually getting it. So the more time we spend teaching them, cueing, using the right words, building confidence, essentially, right? Making them stronger, but then also building confidence. There's a lot of value in that, but how do we use that data to then say, okay, what is enough? We're talking about timing and frequency of testing. We're talking about different modes of building strength or building reactive strength. But how do we truly optimize the athlete through all of these things, right? It's trial and error and then testing. So what should our frequency really look like if we're on the practicing side? How often should we be testing athletes?
I think it comes down to what are you using for monitoring purposes versus what are you using to see, to assess program efficacy. As Paul mentioned, a larger testing battery can be completed, whether it's following a phase of training or even several phases of training to see if we improve. So I would say at a minimum, a larger testing battery should be performed for athletes seasons pre and post season to figure out kind of where they are, but also in the off season. Using the school example, beginning of semester, end of semester, without disrupting the actual performance within the season itself. But if you're using it from a monitoring purpose, I know some individuals here at Pitt will actually test their athletes every time they come in, which could be 5 times a week. But there's other times that you may not necessarily have to assess that all that much, where you can just do once a week. It also depends on how readily available the technology obviously is, how reliable it is. But also understanding that, over testing an athlete can also lead to lack of effort within the actual test itself. I mean, if you ask me to come in and I'm going to do counter movement jump testing every single day, okay, that's not that terrible. But at the same exact time, would I want to do that every single day? Probably not. Especially if I, just came back from like a heavy squat workout or a posterior chain workout where your legs are a little bit sore and everything. It's not going to feel great to rapidly descend into a counter movement. But at the same exact time, asking someone to do something that's even higher intensity and do multiple rebound jumps and things like that may actually, lead to an even further lack of effort. So, I guess to circle back on what I said initially is that you should be able to perform testing as often as possible without disrupting the actual practice, game, etc. Provided that you're getting the data that you need to effectively monitor the individual over the course of the season, practices, etc. But it doesn't have to be. It may not necessarily have to be every single day, depending on what the test is.
We got a couple questions here from um the internet, one from LinkedIn and one from Instagram. The first question is, um, do you choose test or do you execute test with the understanding of gender difference and skeletal alignment differences when it comes to male and female?
Simple answer: no.
Yeah.
You choose the test to test the specific physical quality. If you look at lower body performance, actually, there's a few studies out there now, I think 4 or 5, that show that if you strength match males and females, you do their relative strength based on isometric testing, whether it's single joint or multi-joint, there's no difference between the sexes. It's their relative strength that explains the differences in their lower body performances. Only a few studies showing that, so that could be shown to be completely wrong in the future.
Right.
But ultimately, you choose the test that you're doing to assess the specific physical quality that you're wanting to evaluate.
Yep.
And that shouldn't matter whether they're male, female, young, old, as long as they're physically capable of safely performing that task.
That and we'll give you a chance here, Tim, to answer these questions. That leads right into the next question, the physical availability. So when it comes to injury prevention, what's the difference between, well, let me see how they ask the question. Injury prevention and rehab. What do you do differently in tests when the athlete is returning to play?
Well, first and foremost, you can never fully prevent an injury. I'll just lay that out there first. We can have all the planning in the world, the best strength and conditioning program in the world, all the nutrition perfect, and injuries can still occur. Right. When it comes to assessing an athlete, when it comes to return to play rehabilitation, obviously, if we use just a general injury, they first have to have the capacity to load. And what I mean by that is they have to be able to accept force and create force effectively using the tissues that may be injured. So if we're using a counter movement jump as part of our testing battery, I need to be able to assess an individual and they have to have the capacity to be able to stop themselves if they lower themselves down into a counter movement. They also have to be able to push. So we can use that as a test that monitors their progress, which I think is beneficial. But first, that becomes a collaborative approach between sports medicine staff as well as the strength and conditioning staff, sports scientists, to make sure that they actually have the capacity to do so and do so safely. So beyond that, it also comes down to metrics and kind of where they were testing prior to the injury compared to where they are now. Because you could make the argument that you want to get an individual from a return to play standpoint to a point that's better than where they were. Because in theory, that situation or their force production capacity with whatever test may have contributed to their injury potential. So we want to move them not only back to where they were, but beyond where they were to say that they're actually truly ready and physically able to perform beyond where they were.
Important to that's the first piece of that question from the LinkedIn, or the second piece of that was, what's more important, producing force or handling force? I think I know what you're going to say, but you guys take that.
Well,
Yes.
I think the main thing is that you always produce force.
Right.
So just to correct Tim's terminology a moment ago, he said about accepting forces. We don't accept forces, we produce a force. So if you're landing from a jump, there's no force acceptance. You have to produce a force over a time. So an impulse equivalent to your momentum. So you're not accepting it, you're producing force. And that force or that impulse has to be the equivalent of your momentum when you hit the ground. Otherwise, you won't stop. You'll be in a heap on the floor. So we're always producing forces. It's just different. One is likely to be an eccentric muscle action as the muscles are lengthening, as we're going through flexion of the hips and the knees. And the other is likely to be the concentric phase, so during that propulsive aspect. So we're always producing forces, even if it's isometric. We don't flex, or we land in a flex position and then you're static. You still have to produce force to do that. So they're both really, really important. What we need to identify is which has changed in the athlete. So there is no good research out there at the moment that tells us, is it what's normally termed eccentric and concentric? Depending on the task, it may not be eccentric. So if you look at really short contact rebound tasks, there's minimal movement at the knee, there's minimal movement at the hip, it all comes through the ankle joint. But if you're down at 150 milliseconds, there's not time for lengthening followed by shortening. And there's a series of studies out there show that actually you pre-activate the muscle before you make ground contact. You go through a concentric action, so the gastrocnemius and soleus shortens before you make contact with the ground. You make contact with the ground, you go from full plantar flexion into some dorsiflexion, while the muscle is still going for a concentric action. So you're lengthening proximal and distal end of that tendon. There's no lengthening until you get in the air and the muscle relaxes. In which case, that was all concentric action. We would refer to it normally, the initial part where you're braking, as eccentric, because we see a change in joint angle. But if you put an ultrasound probe on someone's gastrocnemius at that point, all we see is a shortening action, because there isn't sufficient time to go lengthen and then shorten in 150 milliseconds. But the biggest issue with a lot of the research is it's not really conclusive enough. So a lot of people will look at the braking phase or the landing or eccentric component, depending on which term you want to use and depending on which software you've used to analyze your force time data.
Right.
Now, that braking phase, a lot of people just look at the peak force. That tells us nothing. If the peak force is really high, that just tells us somebody's got a really shit landing strategy. So there's a bit of an issue.
Yeah.
And also, if you've got, if I drop from a 50 centimeter box, every time I land to that point where I arrest my motion, my impulse will be the same if I drop from the same height based on the impulse momentum relationship. So that goes back to Tim's point earlier, is we need to then look not just at impulse, but the average force during that braking phase and the time of that braking phase. Because if we've got a really high force, but a really short time, that tells us you've got a stiff strategy. If we've got a really long duration and a low mean force, that gave you a compliance strategy in general. But what do we want from that athlete? Now, during earlier stages of rehab, we probably want them to flex nice and consistently compliant strategy and allow that to dissipate force. What we would refer to normally is force absorption, although we're producing force. But actually, before they return to play, we want them to hit the ground and get off the ground quickly. Yeah, so it depends where you are in that rehab period. And we also need to know, how did they move originally? And has one aspect of that completely changed? Because if they might have the same jump height, but with a completely different movement strategy now. So then we need to go back to our original data. And there's very, very limited research in most sports. There's some good stuff by Dr. Matt Jordan in snow sports.
Yeah.
But we can't apply that in snow sports for something like ACL injuries to team sports, because the mechanism of injury is different and the demand is completely different.
Right.
So we need a lot more research to really be able to unpick, is it the braking phase or is it the propulsive phase, so the eccentric or the concentric muscle actions? Which do we need to train the most? The data out there, unfortunately, most of that research is not very good. And we need a lot more where people understand the biomechanics of the tests they're doing in more detail, and they don't just go with impulse, which misses part of it because we haven't got the time and the force. Well, they just go with peak force, and that really doesn't tell us a lot either.
And
Tim, you want to elaborate? Go ahead.
So dangerous in most athletes, especially if they can't handle the forces.
Tim, did you want to elaborate on that?
I believe the original question was, are basically eccentric and concentric forces important, or what should we focus on? My answer was yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So we had a just for the person that asked the question, they broke your question down in whether we're producing or measuring production of force or handling of force into eccentric and concentric, and use the terminology. So just replace those. And she is actually an undergrad, so she should be able to replace those pretty easily or get some help putting that in context from a terminology standpoint, as we talked about earlier in the show. Chris?
You caught me in a blank. I don't really have a next question at this point. I mean, I think the path that we're on in this podcast is rather clear, right? We're all still in discovery phases of everything. We can't say that there's anything that's certainly concrete, other than let's pick up things that are heavy and let's move them, and we'll probably get stronger, hopefully, if we're moving the right way for our sport. So sports science, right, came in, we'll say about 15 years ago. Paul might argue that because he's been doing it for quite a while. How much are we actually changing the game? Oh, we lost Paul. How much are we changing the game now that we've introduced sports science and we're now starting to learn so much more about the data and the value of the data and the richness of the data?
I think in terms of the context of how we use the data is really important. You know, I'd make the argument that we're doing a lot better job of that and communicating that data and having conversations that lead to, you know, evidence-based decisions, for lack of a better term. But you know, I know I can speak to what we're doing here at Pitt. I know that we have our sports scientist, Zach Witherspoon. We have our strength and conditioning staff and our sports science master's students that help collect and generate reports for all the testing that we do. But I think the biggest thing is just making sure that it's going to be actionable information and not just testing for the sake of testing. Sports science as a whole, yes, part of it is to generate research, but really it's real-time use of that information so that we can benefit practices and training, different drills and things like that. Because, my students are doing some really interesting things right now in terms of looking at, high speed velocity bands when it comes to GPS. They're looking at essentially creating a volume load for different players on a volleyball court. So there's different information that we can use, that whether and a lot of it can be used real time. So to answer your question, Chris, I think where we've gotten to is we have the tech to measure what we want to measure. But I think we're doing a better job of communicating in terms of that information and putting it in usable terminology between the sports science staff and coaching staffs that can actually implement that. Now, that being said, despite having information that a specific athlete may be, their performance is declining over the course of however many testing sessions and everything, or even within a match, the reality is that 80% of one athlete may still be better than 100% of another athlete. So we also have to put a lot of that information into context, because, again, it's ultimately going to be the coach's decision. But from the sports science standpoint, we are supplying that information so that they can make that decision. So, from that standpoint, we're doing our job. But the communication and the soft skills of it is really important as well.
Chris, you want to restate that question?
Paul, did you catch
Paul?
that before you had a little technical?
No, it just froze for a second for me.
Gotcha. So basically what we were talking about is the breadth of sports science that has been around now. How are we then taking that sports science and adding value to the programming, adding value to the process of athletic development?
Yeah, I think part of it goes back to what Tim mentioned in terms of, if we're collecting data, we need to actually use that data. So when people are doing their, almost daily monitoring, you're going to lose the motivation of the athletes for definite if you're not using that information to inform programming, and they don't see any changes. They want feedback on that data collection process. But if you think about how many places we're collecting data, you might have the medical staff collecting data, trying to identify injury risk, of which some of that research is a bit sketchy. You might have us trying to say, are they fatigued? So we're doing jump testing and wellness scores. And again, some of that data can be a bit sketchy. You've got all their time motion analysis data, or
I know that was going to be a really deep thought right there.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it pops back in here. Not sure if we're picking up anything, but we're not getting any sound right now.
I think he's gone. He just hasn't actually been able to be gone yet.
Yeah. But to his point, the data collection that we're using, and I said it as well, is making sure that we use that information to modify what we may be doing if it needs to be modified. From a training standpoint, we obviously test and monitor to assess program efficacy. Is the program working? Does the athlete need to be progressed or regressed? Because we don't always have the information that's going to tell us that directly, but at least it can support one way or another. The best part of it is every single time he comes in and out, you hear like this laser sound. So
yeah. When he comes back, we'll start to finalize what we're doing today. But like I said, earlier in the podcast, I appreciate you guys coming on. It's always very interesting and very enlightening for our listeners, and for me, just a pleasure to have young minds on. I call you guys young minds on. Saying what things really are. A lot of times you get the book answers, or you get the standard professional garb, but you don't really get the meat.
So that's why we select researchers that are also practitioners, because I think that adds the most amount of value, because they give both sides. They give the anecdotal pieces, they give the practical pieces, and they can kind of bring it all together so well, like Tim and Paul do, because they experience it. They feel it. They know. They've had that time. I guess one last question that I think would be important, obviously, for both Tim and Paul to answer: the future of sports science, who knows where it's going to be, how it's going to change. I don't think sports science is going anywhere. We're going to continue to collect data. There's going to be new technologies that come out, new softwares. Hopefully they help us to do our jobs better, which I think was the initial purpose of creating, quote, the field in itself, was to try to help everyone do their job a lot better. Technology came out. Some of it was really so. Some of it was archaic in some senses, and it's just gotten so much better, even over the past 5 years. So with all of that said, what would you say to this now new sector of kinesiology, exercise physiology, to these new students that want to come into sports science? What would you say is kind of their best pathway?
The first thing I'd say is do the basics savagely well. And understand the underpinning mechanisms of things. We had a conversation about jump height, takeoff velocity, and net propulsive impulse that give you the exact same thing. So understanding the output and where that output actually comes from is really important. So I'm not saying that everyone needs to go take an elaborate physics class, because I'll tell you, I never took a physics class. I took a biomechanics class, or several biomechanics classes, but being able to understand not only how the body moves, but how it creates what it does is really important. So the foundations from a knowledge-based standpoint are really important. But what I'd also say is, don't let the technology, how do I want to say this? Don't let the technology overshadow the coaching, because it is meant to be there to complement what you're already doing. Technology, here's an example. AI is obviously growing in terms of program design and things like that. Well, AI can generate a program. It can't coach you. And, I can type in design a weightlifting program that'll improve my snatch and clean and jerk. And it can do that. And it may be a very effective program. However, it doesn't see you perform those lifts. It doesn't see the corrections that you need to make in terms of your technique. It doesn't see you struggle or not struggle during squats, and for adjusting loads and things like that. So it may generate general recommendations, but it'll never replace good coaching. A piece of advice is to get in the gym, and this may sound a little creepy, but watch yourself move, watch other people move in terms of exercise technique, because you can't replace experience in developing a coaching eye and understanding what something should look like. And again, there's no perfect technique, because people move differently, anthropometrics are different and everything. But you should be able to assess what is good quality movement versus poor quality movement by seeing it. And obviously the next part of that is being able to continue to communicate. We are now in a point where people are more comfortable sitting in front of a computer screen, typing things out in response to somebody or texting somebody, instead of just getting them on the phone and having a conversation or talking with people face to face. And I think COVID also had a lot to do with that. It was like the masks created muzzles that were never actually removed. So being able to continue to develop the soft skills and having conversations with individuals, Because if you're going to be a sports scientist, if you're going to be a strength and conditioning coach, sports medicine staff, you still need to be able to communicate effectively. And I think a lot of that has been lost.
Yeah, really good points. It's funny. We just had the psychology roundtable on, and they mentioned the term soft skills. So it's a good piece because basically the gist of it was there aren't really soft skills. These are essential skills. These are skills that we need to have. We need to learn how to communicate. We need to learn how to be effective communicators, which also means listening, not just observing, but listening to someone else. That's highly important. So yeah, those are all really, really essential pieces, I think, to success of any professional, whether you're going into sports science or you're going to go into exercise physiology or you're going into the clinical side or you're going to be an AT or you're going to be a PT. I think there's a huge amount of value to that piece of information. Unfortunately, it looks like we're not going to get Paul back here, Yul.
Right.
He told me that his computer shut down on him. So hopefully he comes back, but we'll see.
Well, I just let him know we appreciate his time. Just like Tim, we always appreciate your time. And, we're happy and would like to consider you guys part of the Performance Talk family. And look forward to the future and speaking with you guys during that time, about all manner of things that are coming up, to include, beard growth. Anyway,
There it is. Shots fired.
Anyway, Chris, you have anything else?
No, this has been Performance Talk with Yul Gordon and Chris Costa. Today was our 2024 Sports Science Roundtable. We thank both Tim and Paul for joining us, and best of luck to Craig out there. We'll see you again real soon, guys.